The morning sky over Eldara should have been purple and gold, but instead it glowed with the sickly green of Valdran bioships, and Kira stood on the highest tower of the Crystal Palace, watching her world burn. Her dragon Theron pressed his massive head against her shoulder, and his mental voice was tired in her mind. Another village fell during the night, and the western forests are gone, and there is nothing left but ash. Kira closed her eyes and felt the bond between them pulse with shared grief, because Theron was more than a pet or a companion, and he was part of her soul, and they had been together for 300 years, and in all that time she had never felt such hopelessness. The Valdran were unlike any enemy her people had ever faced, and they did not want land or resources or power, and they only wanted to consume and to spread, and they turned living worlds into dead husks, and then moved on to the next target. 3 cycles ago, the swarm had appeared in orbit, and the Elven Council had immediately sent distress signals across every known frequency, and they called to the Kreth, who had been their trading partners for millennia, and to the Forian Empire, whose fleets numbered in the thousands, and to the Sentient Collective, who claimed to protect all civilized species. The responses came quickly, but they were all the same. The Kreth said they were sorry, but they had closed their borders for safety, and the Forians said they would pray for Eldara, but could not risk their own worlds, and the Collective sent a message of sympathy and promised to preserve Elven culture in their archives. After the planet fell, Kira had been in the council chamber when the final message arrived, and she had watched the eldest council members, the ones who had lived for thousands of years, sit in stunned silence as they realized the truth. The galaxy would not help them. They were alone. Now she stood on the tower and watched the Valdran swarm spread across her world like a plague, and their bioships dropped warrior forms that consumed everything organic and left only bare rock behind, and the Elven defense forces fought bravely, but magic and ancient weapons were not enough against an enemy that had no mind to attack and no fear to exploit. Theron shifted beside her, and his scales, usually bright silver, were dull with exhaustion. How many dragons are left? Kira did not want to answer, but she owed him honesty. 43 bonded pairs and maybe 20 wild ones in the northern mountains. 3 cycles ago there had been over 500. The dragon made a sound deep in his chest that was part growl and part sob. We are dying, yes, and no one will remember us. Kira wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face against his scales, and she wanted to tell him that someone would remember. But she could not lie to him because their bond carried truth, and right now the truth was that they would all be gone soon, and the galaxy would forget that elves and dragons had ever existed. A sound made her look up, and at first she thought it was thunder, but then she saw them ships, dozens of them, punching through the Valdran blockade with weapons blazing, and they were not elegant like elven vessels or massive like Forian dreadnoughts, and they were blocky and crude and covered in what looked like welded armor plates, and they moved fast and hit hard. The lead ship collided with a Valdran biocruiser and tore it apart with some kind of weapon that made the air scream, and then the entire fleet was dropping toward the surface, trailing fire and smoke in defiance. Theron lifted his head, and his mental voice was filled with confusion. Unknown vessels and primitive design, and no magical signatures detected, and who are they? Kira could only shake her head because she had no answer, and she watched the ships land in the valley below the palace. And they crushed Valdran warriors beneath their bulk, and melted the ground with their engines. Ramps dropped, and figures poured out, and they were bipedal and roughly elven in size, but they wore heavy armor that looked more like metal shells than proper battle weave, and they carried weapons that roared with chemical fire. The creatures moved with brutal efficiency, and formed defensive lines and set up heavy weapons, and one group was already establishing what looked like a medical station. Kira did not wait, and she ran down the tower stairs with Theron following behind her, and they crossed the palace grounds and descended into the valley, and all around her, elven warriors were emerging from their positions, staring at the strange ships with weapons ready, but uncertain. A figure approached her and removed its helmet and revealed a human face female with short dark hair and a scar across her jaw and eyes that were hard but not unkind. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez with the Earth Expeditionary Force, and your distress call reached us 7 days ago. Kira stared at her and tried to process the words, Earth, and I do not know this world. The human smiled, and it was fierce. Most people don't, and we are new to the galaxy, but we picked up your signal and figured someone needed help. 7 days, and Kira struggled to understand because 7 days was barely enough time to reach the nearest civilized system. And how did you mount a military response so quickly? Amy looked back at her ships, and her expression was proud. We are really good at mobilizing when people need us. And besides, we figured anyone calling for help deserved an answer even if no one else was listening. Another human approached, and this one was female, with red hair tied back in a practical style, and she carried a medical kit. Sergeant Lisa Brooks. And I am a medic, and that dragon looks like he needs treatment. Theron rumbled and fixed the human with one ancient eye. You cannot possibly understand dragon physiology, and your species lacks magical sensitivity. Lisa knelt down and pulled out a scanner. Don't need magic to understand biology and chemistry. And right now you are dehydrated, malnourished, and showing signs of toxin exposure. And I brought supplies. She started unpacking her kit, and Kira watched in amazement as the human set up an IV line with steady, practiced hands. Around them, more humans were spreading out and setting up defensive positions, and their weapons were loud and primitive but devastatingly effective against the Valdrin warriors that tried to approach. Amy stood beside Kira and watched the activity. We brought 5 companies, and more ships are coming behind us with supplies and weapons and medical aid, and Earth heard your call, and we are here to help. Kira felt something break inside her chest, and something that had been holding her together through 3 cycles of death and loss. Why and the galaxy abandoned us, and why would you risk your people for strangers? The human met her eyes, and her voice was steady, because some things are worth fighting for, and because no one should die alone, and because humanity remembers what it is like to be the underdog. She grinned. Plus, we really like dragons, and anyone who bonds with a creature like that is worth saving. For the first time in 3 cycles, Kira felt something that might have been hope. The humans worked through the night, and Kira watched them from the medical tent where Lisa was still treating Theron. And the human medic moved between wounded elves and dragons with the same careful attention, and she never hesitated and never showed fear. Even when treating a creature 10 times her size, Amy was everywhere at once and coordinating defensive positions and organizing supply lines and talking with elven commanders. And she moved with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. By dawn, the valley had transformed, and human fortifications ringed the palace grounds, and heavy weapons pointed at the sky and the ground, and teams of engineers were already working with elven crafters to understand the local terrain and resources. Kira found Amy near the command tent, and the human was studying a holographic map that showed Valdrin positions across the continent. Your forces are spread thin, and you have been fighting a defensive retreat for months. Kira nodded and felt shame burn in her chest. We tried to hold the settlements, but there are too many of them, and they keep coming. Amy traced a path on the map. You were fighting the wrong battle, and you tried to protect everything and ended up protecting nothing. Words stung, but Kira knew they were true. What would you do differently? The human smiled, and it was sharp. We concentrate our forces, and we hit them where it hurts, and we take back key positions, and we make them react to us instead of the other way around. She pointed to a cluster of Valdrin biostructures in the eastern lowlands. That looks like a hive cluster, and if we take it out, we cut off reinforcements to this entire region. Kira studied the map and felt her tactical training kick in. After months of desperate survival, it would require a full assault. And we do not have the numbers. Amy looked at her. You have 43 dragon riders, and we have 5 companies of marines and heavy air support. And that is enough, if we are smart about it. Over the next 2 days, they planned the assault, and human officers worked with elven commanders. And at first there was tension, because the humans did not understand magic, and the elves did not trust technology. But slowly they found common ground. Lieutenant Kate Morrison, who commanded the armored unit, spent hours with the dragon riders, learning how they communicated in flight and how they coordinated attacks, and she started developing hand signals that her tank crews could use to work with aerial units. Captain Ryan Phillips, who led the infantry, showed the elven warriors how to use human rifles and grenades, and at first the elves were skeptical of weapons that relied on chemistry instead of enchantment. But after seeing what the rifles could do to Valdrin armor, They started to understand Lisa continued working in the medical tent, and she had recruited several elven healers, and together they were combining human medicine with elven magic and creating treatments that worked better than either alone. Theron recovered quickly under her care, and soon he was strong enough to fly again. And the first time he took to the air with Kira on his back, the human troops below stopped and stared, and some of them raised their weapons in salute. Amy joined them in the air in one of the human dropships, and Kira had never seen a flying machine that did not use magic, and the thing was loud and crude, but it kept pace with Theron easily. The human leaned out of the open door, and her voice came through a radio device she had given Kira. "Beautiful view. And I can see why you fight so hard for this place." Kira looked down at the forests and mountains that had been her home for 3 centuries, and even damaged by the Valdrin, it was still breathtaking. "This is all we have, and if we lose Eldara, we have nowhere else to go." Amy was quiet for a moment. "Then we make sure you do not lose it." The assault began at dawn on the 3rd day, and 43 dragons took to the sky with human gunships flying beside them, and on the ground 5 companies of Marines advanced with elven warriors supporting them. The Valdrin responded exactly as Amy predicted, and they poured reinforcements toward the assault force and pulled defenders from other positions. That was when the real attack began. While the Valdrin focused on the main force, small teams of humans and elves hit targets across the region, and they used explosives to collapse tunnels and incendiary weapons to burn biostructures, and precision strikes to take out command nodes. Kira flew with Theron as part of the main assault, and Amy was in the dropship beside them, and they hit the hive cluster with everything they had, and dragons breathed fire, and human bombers dropped payloads that burned hot enough to melt stone, and infantry teams pushed through the chaos with ruthless efficiency. Lisa was with a forward medical team, and she set up an aid station just behind the front lines and treated wounded as they came in, and Kira saw her work on a young elf who had lost an arm, and the human was calm and steady, and she kept talking to him the whole time, telling him he would be fine, and he would see his family again. The battle lasted 8 hours, and when it was over, the hive cluster was burning and Valdrin reinforcements had been cut off, and the human elf force had taken its first major victory. But it had cost them. Kira walked through the field, hospital, and saw elves and humans lying side by side, and some would recover and some would not. And she felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders. Amy found her there, and the human had blood on her armor and a burn across her cheek. "We won, yes, at great cost." Amy nodded. "War always costs, but we are winning, and that is what matters." She looked at Kira, and her eyes were serious. "Your people fought well, and dragon riders and infantry working together is something special." Kira felt pride mixed with grief. "How many did we lose?" 12 humans and 7 elves and 2 dragons. The numbers felt like knife wounds, too many. The human put a hand on her shoulder. "Any loss is too many, but if we had not fought, we would have lost everyone." That night the elves and humans gathered together, and they shared food and stories, and Lisa taught some of the younger elves a human song, and Ryan showed them how to play a card game, and Kate convinced a dragon rider to take her. Flying Kira sat with Amy and watched the mingling of their peoples. "Your species is strange, and you fight like demons and treat wounded like family, and you laugh in the face of impossible odds." Amy grinned. "That pretty much sums up humanity." "Why?" The human looked up at the stars. "Because someone has to. And because the universe is full of people who will tell you why things cannot be done. And humanity prefers to just do them anyway." She met Kira's eyes. "Besides, you called for help, and we do not ignore that." The victory at the hive cluster changed everything, and word spread across Eldara that the humans had come, and that the tide was turning, and elven forces that had been scattered and demoralized began to regroup, and refugees started flowing back toward defended territories. Kira stood in the war room that the humans had set up in the palace, and Amy was briefing her on the latest intelligence. More ships arrived from Earth overnight, and we now have 12 companies on the ground, and 3 orbital support vessels and supply lines are established. She pointed to the map where blue markers showed human positions. "We also brought engineers and scientists, and they want to study the Valdrin to find weaknesses." Kira felt hope and caution war within her. The Valdrin have been tested by every species in the galaxy, and no one has found a reliable way to stop them. Amy smiled. No one has tested them against human stubbornness yet. Over the next week, Kira watched humanity do what the rest of the galaxy said was impossible, and they pushed the Valdran back. Human engineers studied, captured Valdran specimens, and discovered that the swarm communicated through pheromone signals, and within days they had developed chemical agents that disrupted those signals and threw Valdran formations into chaos. Human scientists worked with elven mages and combined technology with magic to create weapons that were more effective than either alone, and they built bombs that burned with magical fire and rifles that shot enchanted rounds. But what impressed Kira most was how the humans treated her people, and they did not see the elves as primitives who needed saving, or as exotic allies to be controlled, and they treated them as equals, and as partners. Lisa became close friends with an elven healer named Vera, and together they revolutionized battlefield medicine, and they trained teams of mixed healers who could respond to any injury, and they saved lives that would have been lost. Before Kate and a dragon rider named Flynn developed new aerial tactics, and they practiced until human gunships and dragons could fly in perfect formation, and their combined firepower could take down Valdran bioships. Ryan spent his evenings teaching elven warriors human combat techniques, and in return they taught him elven blade work and stealth magic, and soon there were mixed units that blended the best of both species. Theron had become something of a celebrity among the humans, and soldiers would bring him treats and ask to take pictures with him, and at first the ancient dragon was bewildered, but soon he started to enjoy the attention. One evening, Kira found him surrounded by a group of young Marines who were listening with wide eyes as he told them about the first time he had bonded with an elf rider. His mental voice carried to all of them because Lisa had figured out how to build devices that translated dragon thoughts into human speech. I was barely a hatchling, and Kira was only 25 years old by her counting, and we were both young and foolish, and we thought we knew everything. The Marines laughed, and one of them, a young woman named Ashley, asked him what it felt like to bond. It is like finding the other half of your soul, and it is joy and terror and absolute trust, and I would die for her and she would die for me, and there is no greater connection. Ashley looked at Kira with something like awe. That is beautiful. Theron rumbled with pleasure. It is the greatest gift my kind can give, as the humans integrated with elven society. Tensions with the rest of the galaxy began to grow, and the Kreth sent messages demanding to know who these humans were and why they were interfering, and the Forian Empire expressed concern about an unknown species deploying military forces. The sentient collective sent a delegation, and they arrived in a sleek ship and wore robes that marked them as diplomats, and they requested a meeting with both the Elven Council and the human commanders. Kira attended the meeting with Amy, and the collective representative was a tall being with blue skin and too many eyes, and his name was Coordinator Vex. This intervention is highly irregular, and the collective must insist that proper protocols be followed and unknown. Species cannot simply deploy military forces without approval from recognized authorities. Amy leaned back in her chair, and her expression was neutral. With respect, Coordinator, the elves called for help, and the galaxy did nothing. And Earth does not need approval to answer a distress call. Vex's skin darkened with what might have been anger. The situation was deemed too dangerous, and the Valdran cannot be stopped, and intervention would only result in more deaths. Then why are we winning? The question hung in the air, and Vex had no answer, because the truth was obvious, and humanity had done in weeks what the galaxy said could not be done. The collective diplomat tried a different approach. Earth must understand that there are political considerations, and the balance of power in this sector, and economic impacts, and you cannot simply upset established order. Amy stood, and her voice was cold. Let me make something clear, and Earth does not care about your established order, and we care about people who need help, and the elves called and we answered. And if that upsets your politics, then maybe your politics need to change. Kira felt fierce pride watching the human stand up to a representative of one of the most powerful organizations in the galaxy. Vex made a gesture of frustration. This cannot stand, and the collective will need to discuss sanctions and trade restrictions and diplomatic consequences. Go ahead. And Amy was unmoved. And Earth has plenty of resources, and we do not need your approval to do what is right. The meeting ended badly, and Vex left making vague threats about galactic repercussions. That evening, Kira found Amy on the palace walls looking up at the stars. "You made an enemy today." The human shrugged. "We made a lot of enemies today, and the Kreth are angry, and the Forians are nervous, and half the galaxy thinks we are crazy. Does that concern you?" Amy was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, no. And see, here is the thing, Kira and humanity spent most of our history fighting each other, and we had wars that nearly destroyed our world, and we did terrible things." She turned to look at Kira, and her eyes were serious. "But we learned something from all that pain. And we learned that some things matter more than politics or economics or convenience. And we learned that when someone needs help, you help them, and you do not make excuses, and you do not look away. Why do you think the rest of the galaxy forgot that lesson? Because they got comfortable." And Amy said softly, "And they built their empires and their trade networks, and they forgot what it was like to struggle and to fight for survival, and they forgot that civilization is not about how advanced your technology is, and it is about whether you help the person next to you when they fall." Theron landed beside them, and his mental voice was warm. "Humanity is young and fierce and sometimes foolish, but you understand loyalty, and that is worth more than all the wisdom of ancient races." Amy scratched the dragon under his jaw, and he rumbled with pleasure. "We try, and besides, you guys have dragons, and that automatically makes you the coolest species in the galaxy." Kira laughed, and it felt strange after months of grief, but it also felt right. "What happens now?" "Now we finish this," and Amy said, "and we push the Valdrin off your world, and we make sure Eldara survives, and then we figure out what comes next together, and the galaxy. Let them be angry, and humanity is good at dealing with people who underestimate us." She grinned. "Besides, I think the galaxy is about to learn something important." "What is that?" "That when you ignore calls for help, you do not get to complain when someone else answers." The final push came on the 20th day after humanity arrived, and by then, the combined human-elf force had reclaimed half the planet and pushed the Valdrin back to their primary hive complex in the southern wastes. Kira stood in the briefing room with Amy and Kate and Ryan and half a dozen elven commanders, and the mood was tense because everyone knew this would be the decisive battle. Amy projected a hologram of the hive complex, and it was massive and easily 5 times larger than any installation they had hit before. "Intelligence suggests this is the Valdrin Queen ship, and take it out, and the swarm loses coordination, and the remaining forces will scatter." Kate studied the defenses. "That is a lot of bioships, and ground forces and static defenses, and we are looking at casualties in the thousands. If we do a straight assault." Ryan nodded. "We need a better plan." Kira looked at the map, and an idea formed in her mind. "What if we do not assault it directly?" Everyone turned to look at her. "The Valdrin Queen ship is biological, and it needs massive amounts of organic material to sustain itself. And what if we cut off its food supply and starve it?" Amy leaned forward. "Keep talking." "The southern wastes used to be farmland, before the Valdrin consumed it, but there are underground aquifers and root systems that still carry nutrients, and the Queen ship has tapped into those systems." She traced lines on the map. "We poison those sources and use the chemical agents your scientists developed, and we force the Queen ship to either relocate or die." Kate grinned. "And if it relocates, it becomes vulnerable during the move." "Exactly." The plan came together quickly, and human engineers and elven earth mages worked to identify every water source and root system feeding the hive complex, and then they began the careful work of introducing toxins that would not harm the planet, but would make it impossible for the Valdrin to extract nutrients. It took 3 days, and during that time the Valdrin became increasingly aggressive, and they sent raids against human-elf positions, and attacks grew more desperate. As the Queen ship began to starve, Lisa and her medical teams worked around the clock treating wounded, and Kira saw the human medic go 36 hours without sleep before Vera physically dragged her to a cot and forced her to rest. On the 4th day, sensors detected movement at the hive complex. The Queen ship was preparing to relocate. Amy gave the order, and every available unit moved into position, and dragons took to the sky with human fighters beside them, and ground forces formed a perimeter, and orbital support ships locked weapons on the target. Kira flew with Theron at the head of the dragon. Formation, and beside her Amy's dropship kept pace, and all around them were dragons and human aircraft, moving in perfect coordination. The Queen ship emerged from the hive complex, and it was enormous, and easily a kilometer long and covered in organic armor and pulsing with bioluminescent organs, and it moved slowly, ponderous under its own weight. Now the attack began, and dragons breathed fire, and human bombers dropped payloads, and fighters strafed with cannons and missiles and orbital strikes, lanced down from space with precision that took Kira's breath away. The Queen ship tried to defend itself, and it launched biofighters and fired organic projectiles and released clouds of spores. But the combined force had trained for this, and they moved like parts of a single organism. Kate's armored units hit ground forces and cleared a path for Ryan's infantry, and they pushed forward with flamethrowers and grenades and the specialized weapons that Lisa's medical team had helped develop. Based on Valdrin weaknesses, Flynn and his dragon dove in perfect sync with Kate's gunship, and they took out a bioship launcher and then wheeled around to hit another target, and all across the battlefield humans and elves fought side by side with absolute trust. Theron's mental voice touched Kira. We are winning. She felt tears sting her eyes because for months she had not believed she would ever think those words again. Yes, we are. The battle lasted 6 hours, and it was brutal and desperate and exactly as costly as Kate had predicted. But when it ended, the Queen ship was burning and crashing to the ground, and the Valdrin forces were in full retreat. Kira landed Theron near the command post and found Amy coordinating cleanup operations, and the human had blood on her face and burns on her armor. But she was smiling. We did it, and your world is secure. Kira wanted to say something eloquent, but all that came out was, thank you. Amy pulled her into a hug, and Kira was surprised, but she hugged back and felt months of tension finally release. That evening they gathered in the palace courtyard, and humans and elves together, and there was food and music, and for the first time in months, there was genuine celebration. Lisa had her arm around Vera, and they were laughing at something Flynn was saying, and Kate was arm wrestling with an elven warrior twice her size and losing badly, and Ryan was teaching a group of youngsters another human card game. Theron held court with a circle of humans, and he was telling them stories about the old days when Eldara was young, and his mental voice carried warmth and joy that Kira had not felt from him in cycles. Ashley, the young Marine, sat beside him with her hand on his scales. Will you teach me to bond with a dragon? Theron regarded her with ancient eyes. The bond cannot be taught, and it happens or it does not, but if a young dragon chooses you, then I would be honored to guide you. The girl's face lit up. Really, really. Kira found herself standing next to Amy, and they watched their peoples mingle, and the boundaries between human and elf seemed to blur. Your people changed. Us. Amy looked at her. You changed us too, and Earth came here expecting to fight a battle. And what we found was something worth protecting and someone worth standing with. The Elven Council approached, and the eldest member, a woman named Elder Sora, who had lived for 4,000 years, bowed her head to Amy on behalf of all Eldara. We thank you, and humanity answered, when the galaxy abandoned us, and that debt can never be repaid. Amy shook her head. There is no debt, and you called for help, and we came, and that is what allies do. Sora smiled. Then let us make it official, and let Earth and Eldara form an alliance, and let our peoples stand together. The treaty was signed the next day, and it was a simple document because both sides agreed that complicated politics could come later, and what mattered was the commitment to stand together and to help each other, and to never abandon the other when danger came. News of the treaty spread across the galaxy quickly, and reactions were mixed. The Kreth expressed outrage at humanity's interference, and they threatened to cut all trade with Earth and any world that supported them. The Forian Empire was more measured, and they sent observers to Eldara. And those observers returned with reports of human-elf cooperation that impressed even the skeptical Forians. The sentient collective tried to impose sanctions but found that Earth did not particularly care, and humanity had resources and determination, and they were perfectly happy to build their own network of allies. Within a month, 3 other species had reached out to Earth, and all of them had been ignored or dismissed by the established powers, and all of them had heard what humanity did for Eldara. Amy stood with Kira on the palace walls one last time before the human ships departed. "You are leaving, we have to, and there are other calls for help out there. And besides, you do not need us anymore, and your people are strong and you will rebuild. But you will come back." Amy smiled. "Try to keep us away, and Earth and Eldara are allies now. And that means forever." Theron landed beside them. "Humanity taught us something." Important. Amy looked at the dragon. "What is that?" "That the measure of a species is not in their technology or their power, and it is in whether they answer when someone calls for help. And by that measure, humanity is the greatest species in the galaxy." The human laughed. "I will make sure that gets put on a plaque somewhere." As the human ships lifted off, Kira felt sadness and hope mixed together, and she had lost so much during tea. Havaldran invasion and her world was scarred, and many of her people were gone, but they had survived, and they had found allies who would stand with them no matter what, and that was worth more than anything. Theron's voice was warm in her mind. "Galaxy will never forget what happened here." No, and Kira agreed. "And they will never forget that when everyone else turned away, humanity answered the call." 6 months after the human ships departed, Eldara was healing and the forests were growing back, and settlements were being rebuilt, and elves worked alongside the human advisors who had stayed behind to help with reconstruction. Kira stood in the council chamber listening to reports, and the news was good, and food production was back to 70% of pre-invasion levels, and the dragon population was recovering with 15 new hatchlings born in the northern mountains, and trade agreements were being finalized with 3 species who had been impressed by the human-elf alliance. But there were also complications, and the Kreth had made good on their threats, and they had convinced several species to avoid contact with Earth and Eldara, and there were whispers that the sentient collective was planning something more substantial than simple sanctions. Elder Sora looked troubled as she read the latest intelligence report. "The collective is mobilizing a fleet, and they claim it is for peacekeeping operations. But our sources suggest they intend to make an example of us and to show the galaxy what happens when established order is challenged." Kira felt anger burn in her chest. "They abandoned us to die, and now they want to punish us for surviving." Another council member spoke up. "Perhaps we should distance ourselves from Earth and show the galaxy that we are not a threat." No, everyone turned to look at Kira. "Humanity saved us when no one else would, and we will not abandon them, because the galaxy disapproves. And if that makes us a target, then so be it." Theron's mental voice reached the entire chamber because the translation devices Lisa had developed were now standard in all council meetings. "Kira speaks truth, and loyalty cannot be conditional, and humanity showed us what true allies do, and we will do the same for them." The council voted, and it was unanimous, and Eldara would stand with Earth no matter the consequences. Kira sent a message to Amy immediately, and the human responded within hours, via faster-than-light communication. "We knew there would be consequences, and Earth is mobilizing support among our new allies, and the collective is going to find that we are not alone anymore." Over the next weeks, the situation escalated, and the Kreth banned all ships from Earth-allied worlds from using their trade routes, and the Forian Empire declared neutrality, but quietly began moving ships to defensive positions, and the sentient collective issued an ultimatum: Eldara must dissolve its alliance with Earth and accept collective oversight, and Earth must cease all military operations and withdraw from newly established alliances, and both species must submit to mediation. The deadline was 30 days. Earth's response was delivered publicly, and it came from someone Kira had not met, and a woman named Admiral Helen Clark, who commanded Earth's deep space fleet. "The sentient collective does not have authority over Earth or its allies, and we do not recognize their right to demand anything, and we answered a call for help, and we made friends, and if that is a crime, then the galaxy's laws need to change." She paused, and her expression was hard. "We note that the collective mobilized no fleets when Eldara was dying, and they sent no aid when the Valdren were consuming a living world, and they did nothing when a species faced extinction, and now they mobilize because someone actually helped, and that tells us everything we need to know about their priorities." The speech went viral across the galactic network, and suddenly, species that had been quiet started speaking up, and a young race called the Ven, who had been dismissed by the major powers, sent messages of support, and the Traders Guild, which operated independent of government control, announced they would continue doing business with Earth and Eldara, regardless of sanctions, the momentum was shifting. Kira traveled to Earth for the first time, and the journey took 2 weeks even with human faster-than-light drives, and when they arrived she was stunned. Earth was beautiful and scarred, and vibrant, and she could see evidence of old wars and environmental damage, but also massive restoration projects in cities that gleamed with both technology and nature. Amy met her at the spaceport with Lisa and Kate, and Ryan welcomed to Earth. And sorry about the mess, and we are still fixing some things from the last time we nearly destroyed ourselves. Kira walked out onto the landing platform, and Theron spread his wings beside her. Your world is young and barely 5 billion years old. But it has character, Amy laughed. That is the nicest way anyone has ever described Earth's troubled history. Over the next days, Kira met with human leaders and military commanders and scientists and ordinary citizens, and what struck her most was their passion, and they were not cynical or tired like so many ancient species, and they still believed they could make things better, and they still fought for what they thought was right, even when it was difficult. She attended a gathering where humans and representatives from the new allied species discussed forming a coalition, and someone suggested they needed a name that would make their purpose clear. Amy stood, and her voice carried across the room. We are the ones who answer, and when the galaxy turns away, we show up, and when species need help, we provide it, and we do not ask permission, and we do not wait for approval, and we just do what is right. Someone in the back shouted, "The Alliance of Those Who Answer." The name stuck within. Weeks the Alliance had 12 member species, and they were all young races, or dismissed peoples and species that the major powers had ignored, and together they represented a significant economic and military force. The sentient collective's deadline came and went, and neither Earth nor Eldara complied, and the collective fleet moved toward human space. But they were not alone, and the Alliance mobilized, and ships from a dozen worlds gathered at a point between Earth and the approaching collective fleet, and they waited. Kira was there with Theron, and beside her were Amy and the other humans who had fought on Eldara, and all around them were ships from species who had decided that the old order needed to change. The collective fleet arrived, and outnumbered the Alliance 3-1. For 2 days, both fleets held position, and Coordinator Vex sent increasingly aggressive messages, demanding that the Alliance stand down. Admiral Clark's response was simple. No. On the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. An Ephorian fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel and positioned themselves between the two forces. The Ephorian commander sent a message to both sides. The Ephorian Empire has observed the actions of both parties, and we find that Earth and its allies acted with honor and compassion, and we find that the sentient collective acted with political expediency and callous disregard for life. He paused. The Empire will not participate in punishing those who help others, and if the collective wishes to attack the Alliance, they will have to go through us first. The situation hung in balance, and both fleets armed and ready, and Kira held her breath, waiting to see if the galaxy would tear itself apart. Then the Kreth sent a message, and they announced they were withdrawing support for collective sanctions, and they admitted that their response to Eldara's crisis had been shameful, and they wished to make amends. The dam broke, and species across the galaxy began speaking up, and some supported the collective, but many more supported the Alliance, and within hours it was clear that if fighting started, it would not be a simple conflict between two sides, and it would be a galactic civil war. Coordinator Vex's final message was brief. The sentient collective withdraws its ultimatum, and we will engage in diplomatic discussions regarding the future of galactic governance. The collective fleet left, and the crisis was over. That evening, Kira stood with Amy on the observation deck of the human flagship and watched the Alliance fleet beginning to disperse. We changed the galaxy. Amy nodded. We did, and it will never be the same. And species who need help now know they have options, and the major powers now know they cannot just ignore problems and hope they go away. What happens now? Now we build something better, and we create an alliance that actually stands for something, and that helps people who need it, and that never turns away from a call for help. Theron landed on the external platform, and his mental voice reached them through the translation device. Humanity taught the galaxy an important lesson. Amy smiled. What lesson is that? that the measure of civilization is not in power or technology or ancient wisdom, and it is in whether you help the person next to you when they fall, and it is in whether you answer when someone calls. Kira looked out at the stars and thought about how much had changed in 6 months, and her world had been saved and humanity had found allies, and the galaxy had learned that there were still species who believed in doing what was right. And it all started because one young species heard a distress call and decided to answer. Amy put her hand on Kira's shoulder. Ready to go home, Kira smiled. Yes, but this time we go home knowing we are not alone. Theron's rumble of agreement carried warmth and contentment. Never alone again, and that is what allies do. As the ship prepared for the journey back to Eldara, Kira thought about the future, and there would be challenges and conflicts and disagreements, but there would also be friends who would stand together, and species who would help each other, and a galaxy that was slowly learning what humanity had always known, that some things are worth fighting for and that loyalty matters, and that when someone calls for help, the only right answer is to say we are coming. And as the stars streaked past during faster than light, Travel Kira knew that Eldara and Earth and all the Alliance members would face whatever came next together, because that is what allies do. They answer the call,